Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. My name is Teacher Alastair, and welcome to our free trial class for Wright Homeschool Academy's World History course. The purpose of today's session is to introduce you to the course material and give you a sense for a typical class in it. On that note, if you're not planning on purchasing our asynchronous learning package and are rather interested in signing up for our live interactive classes, quick disclaimer that today's session might have a slightly different vibe to it, since as you can see, there are no other students here right now. It's just me. So that means the points in class at which I ask questions would normally be responded to by students raising their hand, answering those questions, discussing amongst themselves, etc. What you're going to see in today's recording is instead, I'll put up a 3-second timer with my fingers like this, and that's to give you enough time to hit the pause button and answer the question however you like. Also, our live interactive classes are exactly 60 minutes long, 1 hour, though today's recording is a little bit shorter. The reason being, again, there's no student interaction throughout, and there's no bamboozle at the end. What is bamboozle, you might be asking? It's a fun, interactive question and answer review game that we've specifically created to help review the material from each class. So I'll show you what that looks like towards the end of today's class, and you can find a link to the bamboozle game in the description box below. One last housekeeping issue. I'll note that it might not be me, Teacher Alastair, teaching you the course. Reason for that is we have lots of educators on our team here at Wright Homeschool Academy. So if you're interested in learning more about our educator requirements, or you want to take a look at our educators' profiles, that's all on our website. And again, the link to our website is in the description box below. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. What you're looking at here on screen says World History 1, Ancient Greece. And that's because the World History course is divided up into 7 sections, which I will show you right now. Each section is 15 classes in length. And today, we're going to be covering only the first class of the first section. So we'll be doing an introduction to ancient Greece, and we'll talk a bit about the Olympics. So if you want to get a sense of what we're covering in each of the sections, I'll show you the schedule for each, and you can just hit pause, take a screenshot, whatever you like. Okay, after ancient Greece, our second section is all about ancient Rome, which actually takes us to about the 1st century CE. We pick up where we left off in section 3, which is titled Early Medieval Europe. And we cover the period of roughly 1,000 years, from about 100 to the year 1000. Our 4th section picks up from there and takes us through the High and Late Middle Ages. So that's the year 1000 to about the year 1500. After that, we get into the Early Modern Era. So this is the period of exploration, discovery, and settlement of the world, and also some revolutions towards the end, as you can see here. The 6th section covers what's called the Long 19th Century. This is a historical phrase which refers to the period from about 1789, so the beginning of the French Revolution, to 1914, so the beginning of World War I. Obviously, that's a little longer than 100 years, hence the name the Long 19th Century. And our final 7th section covers World Wars I and II in the 20th century. So going from about 1914 all the way to 1945, with a little bit on either end as well for context. Okay, so those are our 7 sections. Lots of history to cover, as you can see, some very interesting topics. Let's get into today's lesson. This is the world according to Herodotus. That's the map that you're looking at on screen. Herodotus was one of the first historians. We call him the father of history sometimes. And the reason for that is he was among the first to take the study of history seriously and do it in a way that at least resembles the way that we do history today. So he was a little bit critical of his sources. He compared multiple historical sources. He explained his methodology, the way that he was doing it to his readers. He was a little bit more objective with his facts, and he did some fact checking, et cetera, et cetera. The purpose of this map, though, is to show you what the ancient Greeks knew about the world. You can see that Greece is basically in the center of the map here, and they didn't know about a lot of the world that we know today. For example, they were not aware of the Americas, so North and South America. They didn't know about Antarctica, Australia, New Zealand. They didn't know about China over there in the east. They didn't know about anything south of the Saharan Desert in Africa. They didn't know about Scandinavia or Siberia. So their world was much smaller, you might say, than ours. All right. Now, as I mentioned in today's class, we'll be doing an introduction to ancient Greece and we'll talk about the Olympics. Before we get into those things, though, we really should have a note about historical dating. Not talking about the dating between teenage boys and girls. I'm talking about these letters that you find in history textbooks and you'll hear in videos. People will say in the year 1000 AD or in the year 500 BC. So we should take a moment and discuss what these letters mean. Let's start with this one, BC. Does anybody know, what does BC stand for? If you said before Christ, congratulations, you are correct. So theoretically, what we're talking about here is the time before the birth of Jesus Christ, which right now it's the year 2025 as I'm filming this recording. So according to this dating system, that would mean that Christ was born 2025 years ago. All right, what about the AD? What does AD stand for? Okay, maybe you said after death. If you said that, sorry to say, technically you are not correct, although it is a very common misconception, so you're not alone in thinking that. It's more of a mnemonic. After death is more of a mnemonic, like a memory tool to help people remember. But the reason a lot of people don't know what AD actually stands for is because it's not English, it's actually Latin. It stands for Anno Domini, which in Latin translates into English as the year of our Lord, again, referring to Jesus. Okay, so essentially what we have is the birth of Jesus dividing history into two eras, everything that came before him and then everything that came after him. Now, speaking about Jesus, that's where the next letter pairs come in, CE and BCE. Let's start with CE. Does anybody know what that stands for? CE. Okay, it stands for Common Era. Common Era. And CE refers to the same time period as AD. So right now it's the year 2025, CE, or AD, whichever one you prefer. Okay, and it stands to reason, therefore, that BCE must stand for, yes, before the Common Era or before Common Era. So why the difference? Why are there these two sets? Well, it's because some people, in fact, many people, are not religious. They don't believe in the Christian religion, and they don't think that historical dating should be completely centered around a religious character like Jesus. In fact, there's a growing number of historians who don't believe that Jesus was a historical figure. And so to them, certainly it's inappropriate to use the birth of Jesus as the landmark by which all other historical events need to be measured. However, ultimately, this is a matter of personal preference. Maybe you prefer the older, more traditional AD, BC year designation, or maybe you prefer the newer, more progressive CE and BCE. I'll do my best to use the CE, BCE, simply because it's a little bit more neutral and I don't know, so I suppose inclusive, though you're free to use whichever one you like. All right, now let's talk about the centuries. So a century, of course, is 100 years. So when we're referring to the years 1 through 99 AD, of course, this is called the first century, the first century. Now here you can add the first century AD or the first century CE, but note that I put those in square brackets because it's not entirely necessary. Normally, if you just say the first century, people know what you're talking about. They know that you're talking about this 100-year period, okay? In the same vein, the next century after that, from the years 100 to 199 AD, or CE if you prefer, is called the, yes, that's right, the second century. Okay, note here that the second century is the 100s AD or CE. And the reason for that is because the first century was like the zeros. You could think of it as 0001 and 0099. And that's why you always have to add 1 to the number that you see in front of the year. So the 100s CE, that's the second century. Okay, so let's flash that forward 20 centuries. From the year 2000 to the year 2099, that's the century we're in now. What century do we live in now? I hope you didn't say the 20th century, because we live in the 21st century. Remember, you always got to add 1. So even though it looks like the 20s, right? Oh, this is the 20th century. No. Because remember, this was the first century. The 0 was the first. So we have to add 1. Okay, good. Now let's go into the BC or BCE. So here we're counting down, right? In AD or CE, we're counting up. The birth of Jesus in year 1, by the way, there's no year 0, all the way up to the year 2025, where we are now. We're counting up. Each successive year, we're going up 1. It's the opposite for BC and BCE. We're counting down to the arrival or the birth of Jesus. So that means the year 99 BCE actually came before the year 98, 97, 96, so on. Okay, so what do you think this century is called? 99, the years 99 through 1 BCE. Right, this is also the first century, but it's the first century BC or BCE. And notice there's no square brackets here. You do have to say it. Okay, otherwise people might get a little confused as to which century you're talking about. If you just say the first century and you don't say BC and BCE, then people will assume you're talking about this one, which is removed by 200 years, right? Or could be. All right, how about this? The year 199 to 100 BCE. What's that called? Okay, you're getting it now. That's right. It's the second century BCE. Right, notice again, we're adding 1. So the 100s BCE, that's the second century, not the first century BCE. Okay, and how about the century that we're going to be jumping into in this course? That's this century, the 400s BCE, from 499 all the way down to 400 BCE. What do you think that's called? That's right, it's called the 5th century BCE. Remember, we're adding 1. Okay, so I know this isn't the most glamorous or exciting part of history, the dating protocols, etc. However, it is a key point to get down at the beginning, and I hope that you learned something from this. Now that you've got all this down in your notes and in your mind, let's move on into history proper. So let's start here by where even is Greece in the world? Perhaps you know, perhaps you don't. This map that you're looking at here, all the sort of orange coloring, is the modern day nation state or country of Greece, the Republic of Greece, with its capital here in Athens. Okay, and it is in southeastern Europe. So this is the modern country of Greece. It's in the Balkans in southeastern Europe. The Balkans, by the way, is basically just this giant triangle piece of southeastern Europe that sticks out into the Mediterranean. Okay, so that's the modern day country of Greece. But we're not talking about modern day, are we? We're doing ancient history here. So we're going back 2,500 years prior to this. So let's take a look at what ancient Greece looked like. Notice that there's no coloring on the map here. That's because there was no country or nation state called ancient Greece or Greece. Certainly this whole region, the same region, was still called Greece, but it was just that, a region of people who shared a language and a culture, but who were not organized into a centralized government or state. In fact, each city acted like its own state. That's why we call them city-states, the size of a city, but acted like its own state or country. Okay, so some of the famous city-states of ancient Greece would be, of course, Athens, which, as we saw, is extremely important in Greece today. It's the capital city of the modern-day nation-state of Greece, represented here on this map by the the Parthenon, which is a temple dedicated to Athena. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, from whom Athens gets its name. Athens, Athena, right? There's also Sparta, probably the next most famous of the ancient Greek city-states, represented here by the helmet of one of its hoplites or soldiers, because Sparta was known for being a highly militarized state. And here's another one. How about Olympia? Can you guess what Olympia is famous for? If you said the Olympics, good for you. That's right. That's where the Olympics come from. Okay, not from Mount Olympus, which, yes, is a real mountain in Greece. Although, sorry to say, the ancient Greek gods and goddesses do not live up there. People have been up there and checked. But the Olympics were held in Olympia. That's why you can see a laurel wreath represents the city-state on this map. So the point I'm making here is that ancient Greece was divided into city-states, and the Greeks called these polis. Singular for one of them is a polis. So one polis, two or more polis. And this is where we get some English words like police, politics, politician, policy. All of these come from the Greek word polis. Okay. Now we're looking at the Greek city-states circa 500 BC or BCE. You'll notice that all of this is colored in orange again, but again, do not be deceived. We are not looking at one united country. What we are looking at, according to the legend here, is just areas where Greek people settled, right? So there are Greek-speaking, Greek-cultured people living, ethnically Greek people living in these areas, but they're not all united under one central government like they are today. Okay, the major city-states are here. We can see Athens and Sparta and Olympia, etc. We even notice places where there are major temples or shrines, like the Oracle at Delphi, where dignitaries and royalty would visit and seek a prophecy from the gods. All right. So by the late Archaic period, that's the period from roughly 800 to 480 BCE, the Greeks had established colonies all around the Aegean. The Aegean Sea is this part of the Mediterranean right here. Even into Anatolian lands. Anatolia is a Greek word meaning land of the rising sun. Okay, it's this area over here. So I'll pause here. Guys, why do you think the ancient Greeks who lived here would have called this area over here the land of the rising sun? Well, that's right. That's because this region is to the east. So if you're standing in Greece and you're watching the sun rise, you are looking this way at the land of the rising sun. From your perspective, the sun is rising over there. And these lands are bordering the Persian Empire, which will be very important in our later classes. All right, one more map to show you just how far Greek settlement went. That's right, the Greeks were known for hopping in their well-crafted ships and being skilled navigators and sailing the Mediterranean Sea and beyond to set up colonies and settlements all around the Mediterranean and even the Black Sea. So these red-colored areas on the map show just how far the Greeks settled. So Greeks founded trading outposts, small settlements, and even full-blown colonies in northern Africa, like Cyrene over here, as far as France, so that would be like the city of Marseille, and the Black Sea coast all around here. So for example, Sinope and Trebizond. Very impressive. The Greeks were a very industrious, motivated, exploratory people. All right, guys, that's going to take us to our first video clip. I'll put on the subtitles and I'll turn off my microphone so there's no background noise. Enjoy.
Hey kids, I'm sure by now most of you have heard of a civilization known as ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks were people that lived about 3,500 years ago in what is now southeastern Europe. They had a spectacular rise and then their civilization declined, leading to the Roman Empire. Only in their prime for about 700 years, the Greek civilization had a huge influence on a lot of the stuff in our daily lives and in the lives of people around the world. But before we get into that, let's first talk about what we mean by ancient. By comparison, those of us who live in America have a civilization that's been around for only about 1,000 years. and the United States of America itself has only been a country for less than 250 years, so 3,500 years is a long time ago. Although it was at its peak more than 3 millennia ago, the ancient Greek civilization still lives with us today. Some of the architecture that you see around you, as seen on a lot of our famous government buildings, came from the Greeks. Those columns you're looking at, those were invented in ancient Greece. The 3 main types of Greek columns are Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, Corinthian being the fanciest. How'd you like to have the job of carving the top of a Corinthian column by hand? The theater you're used to seeing, in which you sit down and actors come up on stage and perform for you, yup, that came from the Greeks too. They basically invented the play. There's also philosophy, the Olympic Games, lots of great literature, certain types of painting, sculpture, and other art forms. We can thank the Greeks for all of it. A lot of the words that we use in our English language came from the ancient Greeks as well. There are actually more than 150,000 words that we use that came from Greece. Cool words like hyper, meta, phobia, acrobat, fraternity, even the word cemetery, all from the Greeks. The ancient Greeks were definitely a super successful society, largely in part to the type of government they chose to have, the way they lived their lives, the strong military skills they possessed, and the geography of the region where they lived. But let's take a step back. How did the ancient Greeks rise, fall, and what were their lives like? Let's begin with where ancient Greece was. The ancient Greek civilization lay on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, where the current country of Greece is, and extended east across the Aegean Sea, where there's now a country called Turkey. The Greeks sometimes got around by traveling across the Aegean Sea to the islands and city-states that dotted the region. They also set up shop in some parts of what is currently Italy, France, Spain, and even northern Africa. Some of the most famous ancient Greek city-states were Athens, which is still the capital of Greece, as well as Thebes and Sparta. Some of these city-states fought with each other in wars, with names like the Peloponnesian War, which is almost impossible to spell. So when did the Greek civilization start? Historians consider 800 BC to be the beginning of the Greek civilization, which came after the fall of their predecessors, the Mycenaeans. The first period of the Greek civilization is commonly called the Archaic period, archaic being another word for old. And guess what? The word archaic itself is a word that came from the Greeks. During the Archaic period, lots of stuff happened. The Greeks held the first Olympics in 776 BC, and they ran every 4 years after that. Believe it or not, some of the first Olympic athletes actually competed naked. Also during this period, the famous author Homer wrote his Iliad and Odyssey epics, which are still read widely today. During the Archaic period, mathematics really kicked into high gear when Pythagoras came along. He was famous for studying triangles and figuring out how the hypotenuse of a triangle relates to its angles. If you haven't learned any of that yet in school, then it's all Greek to you. This time period was also when the concept of citizens voting for their leaders, known as democracy, was first introduced by Cleisthenes. He also created the first constitution. One person, one vote. Still one of the best ideas the Greeks ever had. During the Archaic period, the ancient Greeks also first demonstrated their skill at war, when Sparta and Messenia faced off from 743 to 724 BC. The next period in ancient Greek history was when they really hit their stride. This was known as the Classical period, which lasted from about 480 BC to 323 BC. If there was a report card for the ancient Greeks during the Classical period, it might read, Theater. Sophocles wrote the first of his plays, and this became a popular form of entertainment. A+. The art of war. The Greeks proved that they had perfected their military might when they fought the Persians and won. A+. Architecture. The Greeks built their most famous building in Athens, the Parthenon. A+. Philosophy. Socrates spread his teachings and Aristotle tutored the future king, Alexander the Great. A+. Governance. Alexander the Great became king and led the Greeks to conquer Egypt and set up the capital of Alexandria. Nice to have a city named after you, don't you think? A++. The final period of the ancient Greek civilization was from 323 BC to 146 BC. This was known as the Greek Hellenistic period. During this time frame, Alexander the Great died and the Roman Empire started to rise.
Okay, and yes, the death of Alexander the Great and the rise of the Romans is the transition point between the first and second sections of Wright Homeschool Academy's World History course. So a good place to pause the video. All right, so let's move on and talk about why should we study ancient Greece in the first place? If that video clip wasn't enough to convince you, hopefully this section will. So at this stage in class, normally students would be taking turns reading these sentences and discussing some of the more difficult vocabulary in them. But since it's just me, I'll be doing the honors today. So ancient Greece, especially during its classical period from 480 to 323 BCE, which by the way is the period we're going to be covering most in this first 15 class course, is considered the birthplace of modern Western civilization. So that's a pretty good reason right there, right? We all live in modern Western civilization. And so in essence, what we're doing is we're going back to the roots, maybe not of our own ethnic group of people, but the people who produce the ideas and the systems that still dominate our world today. So great thinkers like Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle pioneered the fields of critical thinking, ethics, and philosophy. Playwrights such as Homer, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote timeless works of tragedy and comedy, which have had a lasting impact on literature and drama. From mathematics to science to military strategy and politics to art, society, and entertainment, the world of the ancient Greeks is a rich cultural tapestry with countless stories to tell. That's, you could say that again. I've tried my best to fit in the most important stories of ancient Greece into the course, but there are even more than that. This is like an introduction to ancient Greece. The study of a great civilization like the ancient Greeks connects us with our historical and cultural roots. It paves the way for a broader worldview and a better understanding of the world around us. Indeed, in order to fully appreciate and realize the world that we live in today, we must study the past and where it all came from. And ancient Greece, in my opinion, is a really great place to start. Okay, another big concept you heard mentioned in that first video clip that we watched was democracy. Democracy. So, guys, what is democracy? That's right. It's a form of government in which people vote on issues, or they vote for politicians who then in turn vote on the issues. So in ancient Athens, for example, you can see pictured here, it was a small enough place that they could do the former. People would gather together and just vote on the issues. But nowadays, of course, we live in countries with millions, tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of people living in them. And that's just not practical anymore. We can't all get together and cast individual votes on every single issue. So instead, we vote for politicians. Okay, the word democracy itself comes from the Greek. Demos means the people, and kratos means power. So democracy means power of the people, power to the people. The power of the political system resides in the hands of the people. They decide what direction the city-state will take. Okay, so when and where was the first democracy? I sort of alluded to it already. Do you know? When and where was the first democracy? So the first democratic government was in the polis. Remember, that's the word that we learned for the Greek city-state of Athens. And this was around the 5th century BCE. Okay, guys, the 5th century, remember, we're talking about the 400s BCE. So we're talking about 2,400 years ago. So what was their democracy like, and how is it different from what we call democracy today? Well, one thing I've already mentioned is that they all gathered together and voted on the issues rather than voting for politicians like we do today. But there were some other key differences as well. For example, only local land-owning men could vote. So local meaning you were born there, you were from there, you could trace your family roots to that city-state. You were not a foreigner or an immigrant or a newcomer. And you were a man, not a woman, a child, a slave, or anything like that. and you owned land. So you couldn't even be a poor man. Only local landowning men could vote. Women, children, slaves, foreigners, and poor people could not vote. This meant that there were only a few thousand people voting on each issue. So you can see already how it was possible for them to manage this huge mass of people voting on issues. They really narrowed the number of people who could actually participate in the process. All right, let's talk a bit about life in ancient Greece more broadly. So the ancient Greeks lived over 3,000 years ago. Many of their ideas and inventions still influence how we live today. Society. There was not one country called ancient Greece, as we've discussed. Instead, Greece was made up of city-states, each with its own government, army, and laws. A city-state included the city at the center of it, as well as the surrounding villages and countryside. Important and powerful city-states of ancient Greece included Athens, Sparta, and Corinth. These city-states often fought against each other. Okay, so remember that the Greeks share a lot in common: a language, a culture, a religion, blood, right? They're ethnically related to each other. A region, they're all from roughly the same place. A way of life, very similar ways of life among them. However, they were not united politically. They did not all exist under a big centralized government, and they were often fighting against each other. This is one of the ways that they were able to become so militarily adept, so skilled in matters of warfare and militaries, because they were just very busy fighting each other. They had a lot of practice. Okay, how about the Olympic Games? The first recorded games were in 776 BCE in the Greek city of Olympia as part of a festival to honor the Greek god Zeus. Events included boxing, wrestling, running, jumping, throwing, and chariot racing. Here's a picture of a chariot. The toughest running race was the hoplitodromos, in which competitors wore armor and carried a shield. Winners of the events were given a wreath of leaves, pictured here, and a hero's welcome back home. Did you know, just before each Olympics, a truce was called to stop the city-states fighting so that people could travel to the games safely? Married women were not allowed to compete or even attend the games. And part of the reason for this is because, as mentioned in the video, many of the athletes, especially in the earlier gatherings of the games, competed in the nude. And this was because the ancient Greeks viewed the human body as something to be admired, adored, worshipped, and aspired to. So they wanted to showcase the perfect physical, athletic form and honor the gods who they believed created them that way, by performing these games. The games were not just about sports and competition and physical fitness. They were deeply religious in nature and character. Hence all of the rituals of the passing of the torch and the laurel wreaths, and everything that they were doing, in their view, was rooted in their religious culture. Right? The Olympics were in honor of Zeus, who, as we'll see in a moment, was the chief of the gods. Okay. And again, this is how serious the Olympics are, is that even though the city-states were often fighting with each other, if it was time for the Olympics, everybody had to stop fighting. Hey, put your differences aside, whatever you're arguing about, it cannot be as big a deal as these religious Olympic games. Everybody put the spears down, come, let's enjoy some athletic games together, and you can go back to fighting each other when it's all over. All right, let's take a look at this next video clip from National Geographic. I'll be reading the subtitles on this one as it goes.
The Olympic torch burns once more with the pomp of the ages.
So every 2 years, athletes from around the world gather to compete in the summer or winter Olympic Games. That's today, right? Perhaps you've seen them on TV. First known Olympics were held in 776 BC in a site called Olympia in southern Greece, which we saw on the map. The Olympics was a religious event, highly religious. Athletes competed to honor Zeus, the king of the ancient Greek gods. Note they had many gods. 5% of the freeborn men of the Hellenic world would trek to the temple of Zeus in Olympia. Hellenic just means Greek. Dueling city-states would declare truces so their athletes could take part in the Olympics. It shows where their priorities are. Events included sprinting, wrestling, chariot racing, the pankration, basically the UFC, While only men were allowed to compete in the original Olympics, there was a smaller festival for female athletes. Women's games were held at Olympia and dedicated to Zeus's consort or wife, Hera. Makes sense? The ancient games ended in AD 394, and the Christian emperor Theodosius I banned all pagan festivals. Paganism means anything that's not Christian. In 1896, the games were revived in Athens, 1,500 years later. And in 1924, only 100 years ago, the Winter Olympics were introduced. Of course, there was the Winter Olympics in ancient Greece. Today, we alternate between the Winter and Summer Olympics. Okay, guys, so that's a bit about the Olympics. As I mentioned earlier, they were held in honor of Zeus, the king of the gods, god of lightning, thunder, storms, and the sky. He ruled from Mount Olympus, a real mountain, which I pointed out on the map earlier, with his wife, Hera. And he had many children and myths associated with him. If you guys are interested in learning more about the ancient Greek religious beliefs and the myths that they told, I teach a whole separate course, or we offer a whole separate course at Wright Homeschool Academy called Mythology. And the first 2 sections are all about Greek mythology. Lots of awesome stories there, so check it out. You can find the links to that on our website, again, in the description box below. Okay, so about the Greek Olympics, they were the most important of the so-called Pan-Hellenic Games. Guys, pan is a Greek word that means all, and we've already discussed how Hellenic is just another word for Greek. So this just basically means all Greek games, meaning all the Greek people from all the different Greek polis or city-states were allowed to attend and participate. And they also included the other 3 were the Pythian, Isthmian, and Nemean games. So those are the 4 sets of athletic games that all Greek people could attend. But the Olympics was the most important one because the Olympics honored Zeus, who's the king of the gods. So most important god, most important athletic competition. Makes sense. All right, what you're looking at here is what's called a hoplite. A hoplite is a standard Greek spear soldier, and he was very heavily armored for the time period. You might be thinking that he's not heavily armored because there's large portions of his body that are not covered in armor, but we have to remember that 2,500 years ago, this was extremely heavily armored for his contemporaries. Most infantry back then, meaning soldiers who fight on foot, were very lightly armored compared to this. Hoplites were trained to fight in units. They wielded a long spear and they carried a heavy shield, big, round, heavy shield, which was called the hoplon. That's why the soldier was called a hoplite, named after the shield, the hoplon. This is also where we get the name for the most difficult of the running races and athletic competitions at the Olympics. Do you remember what it was called? I mentioned it earlier. That's right. It was called the Hoplitodromos, basically the running race of the hoplites, because they had to carry their big, heavy hoplon shields and wear a full suit of armor while they were running in the heat. So that sounds like a pretty difficult feat to perform. All right. Also about Greek cultural life is the agora. The agora is the public square where people would go to exchange ideas, debating laws, politics, religion, philosophy, especially in Athens. Each city-state in ancient Greece, or each polis, had its own agora, the central square where there would often be market stalls set up and people would go and discuss amongst themselves. This was like the social media before the internet, right? People would go and actually talk face-to-face. And it was a wide open public square. That's why we say people who are fearful of open spaces have agoraphobia. That's where it comes from. Phobia is a Greek word for fear of open spaces. Okay, so that's the agora. What you're looking at here is the Greek alphabet. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, xi, omicron, pi, rho, sigma, tau, epsilon, phi, chi, psi, omega. From alpha to omega. guys. And this is also where we get the English word alphabet. You'll notice that the first two letters in the Greek alphabet are named alpha and beta. So alpha, beta, alphabet, this is where we get the word for our ABCs. All right, that's going to take us to our final video clip. Here we go.
Imagine being a Greek from a city-state like Athens. You don't have your own farm or opportunity at trade. An opportunity that might be open to you is leaving with a ship and starting a colony in a faraway land along the Mediterranean. As you sail into the wine-dark sea, you fear the wrath of the gods like Poseidon. With you, you bring the sacred flame from your hometown and hope for a brighter future over the horizon. What adventures and dangers are ahead of you? This video covers Greek travel by land, Greek travel by sea, Greek farming, Greek colonies, and Greek trade. Topic number 1 is Greek travel by land. Traveling by land was slow and difficult. Greece has rocky terrain and many mountains in its interior, so it was natural for people to travel by sea. Greece also has thousands of rocky islands that could only be accessed by the sea. Even today, Greece has a ferry system bringing Greeks and tourists back and forth between many isolated locations. People in different city-states in Greece were relatively isolated, and this allowed them to operate with some independence. However, this isolation also created pressure for them to find new farmland and goods to trade. In other words, the Greeks colonized because they were constantly looking for greener pastures because of the limited farmland and natural resources in this beautiful land. Here are a few examples of the varied terrain in Greece. In part 2, I will talk about Greek travel by sea. The Greeks did not use the compass to navigate, but instead they used the stars. The Greeks also did not have lighthouses to warn them of treacherous coastlines. Greeks were never far from water. The entire country is made up of peninsulas and islands. 3 seas bordered Greek lands, including the Aegean, the Ionian, and the Black Sea. The Aegean and the Ionian seas are within the Mediterranean Sea. Sudden storms could put sailors in danger. Although Greek waters appear calm, sea storms can come out of nowhere. To avoid these hazards, Greeks traveled by day and close to shore. At night, they anchored in safe harbors. They navigated by the stars and gave offerings to the Greek gods for help.
Okay, so that video gave you a little taste of what life was like for the Greeks and explained a little bit how their geography, especially all the mountains in Greece, and the fact that each city-state, even though as the crow flies, they're not that far from each other, they're very much separated by those mountains, the rocky terrain, the islands, the jutting peninsulas and archipelagos, etc., which drove the Greeks to hop in their ships and sail around the Mediterranean looking for greener pastures, looking for trading partners, looking for a new place that they could settle and build a life for themselves. Okay, well, I hope you guys learned lots about ancient Greece and that I've sparked your curiosity to learn more. It's at this stage in class where we would normally play our bamboozle game. And what I'll do now is I'll give you a sneak peek at the questions that I would expect you to be able to answer after having taken the class. So over here we can see, in which continent is the modern country of Greece? Which part? Name 3 countries that border it. The ancient Greeks traveled around the Mediterranean and made new homes. What were they called? What is a city-state? What were they called in ancient Greece? Give us some English words derived from these names. Name some important ancient Greek city-states. Why do you think we should study ancient Greece? The ancient Greeks worshipped many gods. Who was the king of their gods, and what do you know about him? The ancient Greeks are famous for holding grand athletic competitions. What were they called, and where did this name come from? What kind of government are the ancient Greeks famous for inventing? What was it like? Scroll down here. When the ancient Greek polis gathered for the Olympics, anybody who was fighting had to agree to stop. What was this agreement called? Tell us 3 facts about the Olympics. Where did men go to debate laws and philosophy? What was the most interesting thing you learned today and why? In which Olympic game did athletes have to run a race wearing armor and carrying a shield? Hint, it was named after the hoplite. What was Sparta famous for in ancient Greece? And what were ancient Greek spear soldiers called? And where did that name come from? So those are just a few of the questions. Well, that's actually all the questions from the Bamboozle. You are definitely encouraged to play the game yourself. Again, the links for the Bamboozle, the website, including where to sign up for classes long-term, are all in the description box below. So head on down there, give them a click, and from all of us here at Wright Homeschool Academy, see you in class.